Thank you for logging on today. It's my privilege to introduce to you Eric B Schultz. He is the former CEO of Sensitech. He is an author, he is a professor, and overall, just in my interactions with him, an awesome guy. He is the author of, if you can see this, Innovation on Tap, and I'm so looking forward to hearing more about what this book is all about. I've read a couple chapters, and it's been a good, fun read so far. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric Schultz. And Eric, take it away.
Great, thanks, Sean. Hi, everyone. I'm going to can you all see my screen now?
We can't see yours. We can see you, but not your screen yet, if you're trying to.
All right, so how's that?
Yep.
All right, we're good?
Let's get rolling.
I like to tell you I'm a power user at this, but I'm not. There we go. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are well wherever you are and looking forward to a good long weekend. The book is Innovation on Tap. It was published by Greenleaf, a book group, last winter. And here's a picture of it in Barnes & Noble. If you could walk into Barnes & Noble today, this is what you might see. Hopefully that'll happen again soon sometime. But it's online, it's on Amazon, it's on Kindle, it's on Audible. So I wrote the book really for two kinds of readers. One is just a reader in general American history and business history. But the second is for entrepreneurs who are looking for a little perspective and some wisdom and some ways to improve their chances of success. And that second reading is the one we'll focus on for the next 40 or 45 minutes. Here's my agenda. I will provide a brief bio, just to put the book in some context for you. I'll tell a short, probably untrue, but useful story about rats, which will give you some of the underlying philosophy of the book. Then I'll do an overview of the book and introduce you to a bunch of really interesting entrepreneurs. And we'll finish up with a couple of mini case studies which highlight some of the underlying lessons of innovation. Along the way, I am going to violate the most sacred principle of the book talk. I'm going to mention some other people's books. And if they show up on my talk, it means I am recommending them to you. So I would stick them on your reading list. My background is business and entrepreneurship. My most recent full-time position was as CEO of Sensitech, which is headquartered in Beverly, up here on the North Shore. Sensitech monitors the cold chain for food and pharmaceutical companies, and it was acquired by Carrier in 2006. Since this is a Boston-based audience, I'll also mention I served for almost a decade as a CEO partner at Ascent Ventures. They were an investor in Sensitech. And in that capacity, I spent a couple of years as executive chairman of Hubcast before it was sold to Mimeo. And for you musicians, I also sat on the board of advisors of Zildjian in Norwell, another great local company. Anyway, a few years after the sale of Sensitech, I decided to move to a consulting role because I really wanted to do some writing. It was not my first opportunity to scratch this itch. In 1999, between companies, a friend and I had written a book about King Philip's War. So along with my MBA, I have a degree in history and really a love for that subject. And I thought, well, why not try to combine my interest in history with my background in entrepreneurship and write a history of innovation in America from the revolution to, say, 2020, which was really just a stupid idea. Or I'll be a little more generous, overly ambitious. The amount of material is overwhelming, and I recognized from the start that I would need to structure the book in a way that would allow me to make some good choices about what content to include. As I stepped down as CEO of Sensitech and started this work, I was distracted, but in a good way. The folks at Carrier discovered that I had written about King Philip and asked me to write their corporate history, which became a book called Weather Makers to the World. And the research for that book let me spend time in the Carrier archives in Syracuse, surrounded by Willis Carrier's correspondence and engineering studies from some of the company's most famous jobs like the US Capitol and Macy's and Madison Square Garden. This was a gift because Willis would become a chapter in the book I was planning to write. And then not long after that, Carrier asked me to partner with their VP of Sustainability, John Mandyke. John and I wrote Food Foolish, which was based on research being generated by the United Nations that tied together food waste, hunger, and climate change. And this is us trying to look like farmers here. The background research I did for that book would also help me organize an entire section of my new book. So in one sense, I had a bunch of delays. In another, I had a running start on my own project, thanks to these two writing assignments. Okay, now let me tell you a story. There's a scientist who publishes a paper that contains these extraordinary findings about rats. In fact, the findings are so remarkable that a group of his colleagues decide to visit him in the lab. And when they arrive, they find him standing near one of his benches, which is covered with beautiful, immaculate bound notebooks. And he announces, Here is my research. And then he points to a little tiny cage in the corner and he says, and there's my rat. Now, this isn't a story about rats. It's a story about the logic of knowledge acquisition. And it's kind of funny until it's not. And here's what I mean. You'll all remember this book, right? It's a wonderful biography written by Walter Isaacson and given to many CEOs as a holiday gift in December 2011. But then, much to the horror of their teams, starting in January 2012, some CEOs began to act exactly like Steve Jobs, right down to the words and phrases that he used. The CEO of Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes, is a perfect example. John Carreyrou says in Bad Blood that her management team knew what chapter she was on by how she was behaving that morning. In other words, Steve Jobs was her rat. Right? By modeling herself after the most remarkable entrepreneur she could find, she thought, this is how to be successful. And you may well work with people who have Mark Zuckerberg or Reid Hoffman or Elon Musk as their favorite rat. And there's nothing wrong with having a role model. But the underlying logic of innovation on tap is that you want to know about as many rats as you can, or in our case, as many entrepreneurs and their stories as you possibly can. None of them will perfectly describe the business model that you want or tell you exactly how to lead your team or how to market your product. But think of history as this enormous laboratory that's full of the most amazing experiments ever. And the results of those experiments conducted by entrepreneurs on human beings are really just good, revealing, instructive stories. And they're yours for the taking if you're willing to put the energy into acquiring them. Some of us are STEM people, but it turns out that genetically and culturally, all of us are story people. And economist Daniel Kahneman has a nice way of saying, no one ever made a decision because of a number. They need a story. Entrepreneurs run smack dab into this in the guise of the elevator pitch. Tell me a good story and I might invest in you. So the more stories you gather, the greater your perspective, the better you are at integrating these stories into your work and seeing the connections to what you're trying to accomplish, the more wisdom you'll possess. Mark Twain, I don't think he said this, but he's credited with saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So what I'm suggesting to you as an entrepreneur is that those rhymes are worth finding because they may be very profitable to you. So now let's talk about the book and I'll show you how it works. For Innovation on Tap, I created a virtual barroom where I could invite both living and dead entrepreneurs to meet and share their stories. And by bringing the living entrepreneurs together with the dead entrepreneurs, they could compare experiences, maybe reinforce a lesson, tell a joke. It was kind of a Greek chorus, but with alcohol. So once I had the virtual bar, my next question was, who gets in? If I was going to write about entrepreneurs for 300 pages, I'd better define what they are. And for that, I needed a bouncer. So I turned to Joseph Schumpeter, the famous Austrian economist, who gave us the term creative destruction. Schumpeter was brilliant, and he was also a character. And one of his famous quotes was, early in life, I had three ambitions. I wanted to be the greatest economist in the world, the greatest horseman in Austria, and the best lover in Vienna. And then he would lean in and look you in the eye and pause, and he'd say, well, I never became the greatest horseman in Austria. And I thought, that's my guy, an economist with a sense of humor. He actually taught at Harvard from 1932 until his death in 1950. And since the 1980s, his work has been revitalized, and he's become the economic godfather of entrepreneurship. So this is what my new bouncer said. An entrepreneur does two things and only needs to do two things. He or she brings a novel combination to market, two or more things that have never been combined together. It doesn't have to be new, doesn't have to be technology. It can be chocolate and peanut butter, it can be luggage and wheels, it can be heating and air conditioning. And two, disrupts an economic flow. So if you say this sort of in modern English, you'd say, an entrepreneur launches an innovation and creates new customers where none existed before. Entrepreneurs are the economic force from inside capitalism that can keep it growing theoretically forever. And Schumpeter's is not the only definition of entrepreneur, but it's the one I like because it focused on economic impact. In other words, in my book, entrepreneur is not a particular kind of person. I didn't have to worry if they were courageous or extroverted or well-educated or smart or even ethical. They didn't have to have grit. They could be accidental and stumble into an innovation, or they could be reluctant and only want to innovate long enough to make some money and get out. And they could also be risk-averse individuals working hard at innovating from inside giant companies like Apple or Carrier. The last point's important. We often confuse startups with entrepreneurship, especially tech startups. Under Schumpeter's definition, there will be thousands of startups this year. Fast food franchises, hairdressers, dry cleaners, plumbers, architects, Me Too app makers, who launch businesses who are not entrepreneurial because they don't offer a new combination. They just compete for customers that already exist. And he had a very clever way of saying that. He said, add successively as many male coaches as you please, you will never get a railway thereby. Again, let me translate for you. Launch as many new taxi companies as you want, you'll never create an Uber. So when guests show up at the door of our bar room wanting to enter, Schumpeter doesn't care whether they drove a Tesla to the bar. He doesn't care if they're wearing a hoodie. What he's looking for is innovations that create new customers. So at this point, we've got some underlying logic for the book. We've got a bar room, we've got a bouncer, and I'm starting to invite in entrepreneurs. And there are some big themes that begin to emerge in my research. So we created a set of icons in the book to identify these themes and build a kind of roadmap for the reader. And it might be worth saying here, if you're a general reader, you probably read the book cover to cover. It's chronological, the themes build on one another. But the entrepreneurial reader probably treats this more like a collection of case studies, and you can dip in at any point. Each chapter is designed to really stand on its own and have its own set of lessons. And I'll point some of those out now as we go along. So the earliest theme in innovation on tap is mechanization. It's really the theme of the first industrial revolution. If you were a person who could work with cams and gears and ratchets, if you could create a machine that replaced human labor, you had all kinds of possibilities as an entrepreneur. And there are two entrepreneurs in our bar room who really illustrate this theme. One is Eli Whitney. He is one of America's first serial entrepreneurs. He invents the cotton gin, and then he becomes a major producer of muskets for the United States government. Whitney is as complicated an entrepreneur as there has ever been in America. His many cases are a little involved to do today, but they ask questions like, how did a Massachusetts farm boy who had never seen a cotton plant in his life arrive in Georgia and a month later solve a mechanical problem that had been unsolvable for a century? This question bothers historians. There was a book written in 2016, just 4 years ago, that said, Whitney did not invent the cotton gin. But in my book, I try to look at the question through the lens of an entrepreneur. So open innovation and how to ask better questions to get better solutions. Another mini case study in the chapter is, should an entrepreneur ever lie to his investors? And Whitney tells a whopper of a lie during a product demonstration to no less than John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And when he does that, he saves his company. If you like, you can compare it to Steve Jobs' legendary product demo of the iPhone in 2007 when the product didn't actually work. And I sometimes think that in the same way that Eskimos are supposed to have 50 ways to say snow, entrepreneurs have at least 50 ways to tell little white lies. This is a good piece to add to your reading list. Dan Eisenberg was a professor of mine at the business school. His article appeared in the Harvard Business Review in 2010. And there's another lesson in the Whitney chapter too, and that's a recognition of the outsized role that the US government plays in American innovation. Whitney's entire production of muskets for a decade was underwritten by the federal government. And one of the entrepreneurs in the bar room, I think it's Oliver Ames, says that the 5 most innovative words in all history are, in the preamble to our Constitution, provide for the common defense. Because the government invests to protect us, and entrepreneurs win everywhere. You may know, for example, that all 13 of the fundamental technologies in the iPhone were underwritten by the US government. An economist, Mariana Mazzucato, has a brilliant book in which she says, being foolish is much easier in a country where the state plays the pivotal role in developing high-risk technologies. So the Whitney chapter is like 10 pounds of sand stuffed into a 5-pound sack. There's a lot there, and I think it will resonate with a lot of today's entrepreneurs. The other entrepreneur who represents mechanization in the book is Oliver Ames. Oliver worked in Easton, Massachusetts, not too far from me, early 19th century, and he mechanized the production of shovels. His father was a blacksmith. His sons would one day produce 2/3 of all the world's shovels. So Oliver was the entrepreneur that connected those two worlds. And Oliver's shovels would help fight the War of 1812 and dig the Erie Canal and build the Transcontinental Railroad. If you've never seen a trip hammer, this is the basic mechanization that Oliver used. It's driven by water power, And you can see where he could put the shape of a shovel underneath and stamp shovels out pretty quickly, and compare that to a blacksmith, which is what he was really replacing, who might be able to do a shovel or two a day, one at a time. You get a sense for what's going on in this period. By the way, if you'd like to take a tour of the Ames shovel collection, you can actually visit it at Stonehill College in Easton, but there's also a nice online presentation. Okay, the second theme, which begins in the 1830s, but really takes off after the Civil War, is mass production. This is mechanization on steroids. We start to see purpose-built machines linked together inside of these giant factories, the rise of the railroad and the introduction of the telegraph. And we see spectacular increases in volume and in the speed of business. 19th century Americans actually refer to it in almost science fiction terms. They call it the annihilation of space and time. To illustrate mass production, our imaginary barroom invites King Camp Gillette, a traveling salesman for Crown, Cork, and Seal, a company that made disposable bottle stoppers and bottle caps. Gillette patents a thin steel shaving blade and handle to lock it down. That's the creative part of Schumpeter's equation. And it's an idea that's going to put a lot of barbers out of business. That's the destruction part. Many case studies in this chapter include the myth of the razor and the razor blade, and the value of weak ties and weak networks to entrepreneurial success. That is, your willingness to make uncomfortable leaps beyond your close friends and colleagues in order to get stuff done. We also invite Mary Elizabeth Evans. Mary Elizabeth started selling homemade candy just to feed her family. She is the definition of a reluctant entrepreneur, but she ended up mechanizing and scaling her business into a national brand. By 1920, her competitors thought she was the front for a giant conglomerate because no woman could possibly be that talented and successful. And she reminds me a little bit of Disney. Her face to the customer was described as warm and in very warm and fuzzy terms. The press called her offerings homey and even housewifey, believe it or not. But behind the scenes, it was cutting edge and tough as nails business practices. She was really a smart woman. And she impressed the heck out of Herbert Hoover, who sent her to Paris in World War I to run the US Central Diet Kitchen. Mary Elizabeth had tea rooms and restaurants in a number of locations, including in the basement of the Park Street Church in Boston. And she died at 100 years old in 1985. She recorded a wonderful history of her life at Radcliffe's Schlesinger Library, and that was the basis for my chapter. I also wanted to talk not just about mechanical mass production, but about the ability to scale services. So I invited John Merrick to the bar. Merrick was an inspirational entrepreneur living in Durham, North Carolina. He built the largest Black-owned insurance company in the world, and it allowed many Black Americans for the first time ever to have access to life insurance. Merrick is credited with saving hundreds of poor families who lost their breadwinner during the 1918 influenza pandemic. And his generous entrepreneurship helped to create a thriving ecosystem in Durham in what would come to be called the Black Wall Street. Finally, in mass production, I had to feature Willis Carrier. I'd practically lived with him for a year in Syracuse. Carrier was the force behind the development of modern air conditioning. In many industries, it's impossible to mass produce without stable and predictable temperature and humidity. Textiles, candy, pharmaceuticals, any kind of wood product and high tech. The cloud would be much more difficult to maintain without modern air conditioning. In fact, two of Carrier's earliest customers are Schraff's Candy in Charlestown, which can't keep their chocolates from sticking together on the assembly line, and Gillette, which couldn't keep their blades from rusting in production. Stainless steel wouldn't come out until the 1920s. So, in the book, I tell two stories about Willis. The first is about his first installation of modern air conditioning. It was in a printing shop in Brooklyn in 1902 to get Judge Magazine to subscribers on a timely basis. At that time, in order to do 4-color printing, you had to run the paper through the press 4 times, once for each color. And if the humidity changed in between press runs and the paper enlarged or contracted just a little bit, the color register would be off. So that's the kind, you've probably seen it once in a while. The Globe has their funnies come out that way on a Sunday. So what he was trying to do was fix a very small problem, but what he ended up doing was creating the American Sun Belt, the nation state of Singapore in a sense, in today's $140 billion HVAC industry. It's a good reminder, I think, that It's good to want to put a dent in the universe. That's a really nice graduation speech, but innovating to solve the problem that's right in front of you, the one that really improves people's lives now, is the better play, and the universe will generally take care of itself. I also tell the story of the launch of modern air conditioning on Broadway. This is Memorial Day 1925 at the Rivoli Theater. Because it turns out when people expand and contract, they stop going to the movies in the summer. And many movie theaters, especially in the South, but up into New England, close for a month or two during the summer. So modern air conditioning solved that problem. In fact, you can add the birth of the summer blockbuster to Willis Carrier's Dents in the Universe. And the movies get us to the third theme of the book, which is consumerism. Beginning in the 1890s, mass production creates a whole new problem. Businesses running out of customers, right? These giant automated factories were delivering more goods than Americans could purchase, than the economy could really absorb. And entrepreneurs had to learn to build consumers as well as they built goods and services. If you had described a group of Americans in 1876, you would have called them American citizens. By 1920, you are calling them American consumers. And this is the world in which we live, right? In business school, you take consumer and industrial and strategic and online marketing. When you go to see angels or a venture capital firm, they will be as interested in how you are going to create customers. What's your value statement as how you will build your product or your service. So building product and building customers by about 1920 have become two sides of the same coin. We invite three entrepreneurs into the barroom to tell the story. Elizabeth Arden is a Canadian immigrant. Her real name is Florence Nightingale Graham. She moves to New York City in 1908 to build $1 billion empire that redefines beauty in the United States. We'll do a quick case study with her in a second. And J.K. Milliken founded the country's largest textile bleaching factory and built, beginning in 1900, a storybook workers' village. The houses, the gardens, a farm, a hospital, even a baseball team. It was like Sim City, but for real. And it happened in what happened in my hometown, North Dayton, right here in Massachusetts. Milliken's concept was that his factory didn't stop at the walls of the building, but also included the village. And his most important raw material was knowledge workers. And the story he tells at the bar is about a workforce that doesn't mind being treated like a raw material in 1905. But as consumers in 1950, they begin to object. For example, if you lived in one of his company houses, you couldn't choose your own wallpaper, you couldn't choose your own paint, you couldn't borrow money for a piano because he considered that an extravagance. And Milliken's mini case study asks, what are you willing to exchange for your loyalty and a paycheck? And I think there are a lot of knowledge workers today who have great pay and great benefits, but in return are on the clock 24/7 and feel a little bit like raw materials. And I also feature in this section the giant of American consumerism, Alfred Sloan, CEO of General Motors. He helps invent the model year. He offers something called consumer finance. He perfects the centralized, decentralized organization structure. He invests heavily in design thinking and invests heavily in long-range R&D. And under his leadership, GM becomes bigger than half the countries in the world. And he crushes Henry Ford, the legend. Anyway, since we're in a barroom, you know, Williams or DiMaggio, MJ or LeBron, I make a barroom argument in this chapter about Sloan. I believe he's the most successful entrepreneur in American history. It's unprovable, but it's kind of fun to try to make the case. Okay, so now that American entrepreneurs are good at building stuff and good at building customers, we begin to overwhelm our environment. The first World's Fair ever to feature conservation is Expo 74 in Spokane. And in 1988, a NASA scientist told Congress about something he calls global warming. So in the same way that consumerism helped to fix the problems of mass production, entrepreneurs now engage with something called sustainability to try to fix the problems of consumerism. And I start this chapter this section, I should say, by welcoming into the barroom Stephen Mather, who founded the National Park Service, where you see the fight between sustainability and consumerism really play out over the last century. Mather's a fascinating guy in part because he struggled with bipolar disorder. And what drew him into nature in the first place is that he could heal himself by being outside. We know there's good science behind this phenomenon now. He's a master at doing what we are all supposed to do, which is exploit your strengths and manage your weaknesses. And by the way, Mather was famous earlier in his career for creating the 20 Mule Team Borax advertising campaign, which he did with $0, creating a viral marketing campaign that turned this white commodity into a national brand. He's really brilliant. And it's a story worth knowing. And it's an experience that will contribute directly to his success in getting the National Park Service lobbied and launched. Now, at this point, I'm going to take a sip for a second, but at this point, Innovation on Tap begins introducing living entrepreneurs into the barroom. These are people I was actually able to meet and interview. So in the sustainability section, I profile Emily Rochon, who's an environmentalist. She's an attorney who worked with Earth Justice and Greenpeace, among others. And her job is to create new sustainable business models. And there's a huge focus in Innovation on Tap on business models. History and all those rats we study suggest that learning how to build and nurture and sell and pivot your business model is job number one for an entrepreneur. It can make up for everything else: horrendous leadership, horrible management, and even rotten culture. Emily has a nice way of saying how she builds the argument for renewable energy. She says, I'm not a finance or technical person, but what I can do is provide the framing, story, and arguments required to do the good work that needs to be done. That's how I engage in things. What she's saying, of course, is that stories and storytelling really do work. Also in the sustainability section is another Boston local. This is Kate Sincata. She's the executive director of Saha Global, which brings clean water to places in desperate need, like Ghana. But the mini case study here is that Saha's real business, I think, is to identify, train, and then nurture new female entrepreneurs, the people who operate and market these clean water businesses. In other words, Saha Global is really exporting entrepreneurship. There are lots of interesting lessons in this chapter, but the quote that will give you a good sense for Kate is this: I'm very used to big disasters happening, and I'm confident that it's going to be fine. We're going to figure it out. If we have to change everything we're doing tomorrow, we'll just do it. She is the kind of entrepreneur you would want in the middle of a pandemic. And Viraj Puri is the CEO of Gotham Greens, pioneer in the field of urban agriculture. You want a Schumpeterian combination: put a garden on a rooftop in the middle of Manhattan. And the mini case study here is, well, we'll let Viraj tell it. After we built the first greenhouse and had VCs knocking on the door saying this is brilliant and we should build 100 of them, but as a practical matter, plants are not widgets. So he turned down the first wave of financing. And what did he focus on? The business model. And when he and his partners thought they had it right, then they took venture funds, but not until. It's a good story, and as you know, his company is growing in leaps and bounds right now. Okay, the fifth and other very current theme in the book is digitization. It's kind of the new mechanization. If you can write code today, the way an early entrepreneur could use gears, you have a solid path into entrepreneurship. In this section of Innovation on Tap, we feature Brenna Berman. She's the current executive director of Tech. She's the former CIO for the city of Chicago. And she introduced predictive analytics into city government to determine, say, the next likely outbreak of rats, and to point her limited health inspectors at the restaurants most likely to be in violation of code. She is all about how you define and build community in an urban setting. And Jean Brownhill, she's the CEO of Sweeten. She built an online community that disrupted the traditional residential and consumer renovation space. Jean is one of the few Black female entrepreneurs in the United States who have raised more than $1 million in venture capital, and she has raised way more. Jean is dyslexic, which she didn't figure out until I think late high school, early college, and she talks about the times she had to, what she calls, rewire her brain to make sense of the world. And I think one of the most stunning scenes in the book is when she is caught on a subway at 9/11. Jason Jacobs is local. He turned a passion for running into one of the iPhone's earliest apps, Runkeeper, and formed a booming online community. I used the app, that's how I met him. And if you're keeping an eye on him today, he's also doing the same, building community around climate activism. Jason may have my single favorite quote in the book. It's kind of a, I don't know, Ulysses or William Faulkner sized quote, which really captures a particular moment in entrepreneurial history that some of you will remember well. Now, Runkeeper had, I think, 14 employees at the time, a great company making money, and Jason is about to raise 10 million in venture capital because he's been talked into it by investors who want him to build something called a health graph. And it will be the biggest mistake he makes. And he says, if you take some narcissistic 20-something with a megaphone, all hopped up on energy drinks, with a big office and the press talking about him all day long, in this emerging field that nobody knows anything about, that everyone thinks is the next big wave, and he just lays it out there with fervor. In that moment of heat, maybe you can make a lot of things happen that couldn't otherwise. It's kind of a don't worry about the business model part of the book, and it almost costs Jason the company. But he recovers quite nicely, and it's a very good story to add to your collection. And to finish up, Guy Filippelli is a West Point grad. He's a soldier who used machine learning to reduce casualties on the battlefield. And then when he became a civilian, he turned that into a corporate security play called Red Owl, and he's now got a venture fund. And Megan Weingrad worked as an entrepreneur with General Mills and with Express Scripts before launching her own company. So kind of a nice transition from intra to entre. And she was on the team that convinced Beyonce to promote Hamburger Helper. So there's a novel combination for you. And Brent Grinna, who many of you probably know, he's the CEO of Evertrue here in town, a pioneer in advancement software, helping the development teams change the way they engage with alumni, which is, as you know, a world that's been completely turned upside down right now. Brent has a kind of natural ability to build communities in ways that make this chapter really worth reading. I shared it with my own children when they were out looking for jobs. So those are the 5 themes, which I call in the book dominant narratives. They help define each era, but there's one more, and it kind of runs alongside these 5 themes throughout all of American history. And it captures a lot of other kinds of innovation, often from people who are not allowed to participate, who are cut off from the networks and educational opportunities of the dominant narrative. And I call this social and cultural entrepreneurship. There are a bunch of interesting barroom entrepreneurs profiled under this theme. To name just 3, Thomas Downing was a Black entrepreneur who around 1820, while Whitney is building muskets and Oliver Ames is stamping shovels, launches the first oyster house in New York City where men and women can dine together. It's a very simple but very powerful innovation. He ends up attracting really the power brokers of Wall Street who are upstairs cutting deals in his restaurant while Downing is using the profits to run a stop on the Underground Railroad down in the oyster cellar. It's a great story. Buddy Bolden, King Bolden, was a masterful cornet player from New Orleans who would be one of the first Americans to play what we would call later jazz. One of the interesting mini case studies in this chapter is to compare New Orleans in 1900 as an innovation community with Silicon Valley in 2000. They both worked in very similar ways, one with musical notes and one with software code. And there's a chapter devoted to Branch Rickey, who with Jackie Robinson will change the face of baseball in America. Rickey is a fascinating guy. He was practicing analytics, Moneyball, long before Billy Beane. And one of the central questions in the chapter is about motivation, right? Did Rickey sign Robinson because Rickey was a good Christian and doing the right thing? Or was he a good capitalist who wanted to sell tickets and win the World Series? And if we get the right result, either way, should we care? I think it has lots of implications for today's climate investments. So that's the book. Not quite everyone, but most of the entrepreneurs at the bar. So let me use this last stretch of time to focus a little more closely on 2 of these entrepreneurs. The first is Elizabeth Arden, and it involves the simplest question to ask and one of the hardest to answer. What business are you really in? One of Arden's most famous and successful products was the Vienna Youth Mask. It was paper mache and tin foil with electricity flowing through it, and it was supposed to make you younger, look younger anyway. Women paid $200 for 32 treatments in 1937. That was the depth of the Great Depression. $3,600 today. A lot of money for a product that probably didn't work. Doctors were baffled, scientists were baffled, but customers loved it. And when I talk to entrepreneurs about this product, the conversation often begins with the question, does your product actually have to work? It's not as obvious an answer as most people think. But the better question, I think, for this particular case study is, what business was Elizabeth Arden really in? Maybe her product really did work. Was she in the make your face look younger business? I don't think so. By 1937, was she even in the beauty business? When you walked through her signature red door, you were going to be pampered for the next few hours, away from the breadlines and the hard times of the Depression out on the street, and maybe away from your children. And I'm thinking of some of you who might be parents in these days of sheltering at home. Define that business properly, and you'll know what Elizabeth Arden was selling with her Vienna Youth Mask and why she was so successful. And by the way, her personality is very close to Steve Jobs. She's brilliant but mercurial, kind of tough to work for. but her business never stopped growing, never lost money during the Depression. The text I usually highlight here is Ted Levitz's Marketing Myopia. I'm sure you've all seen it or read it. His major lesson from this is sometimes translated as, people don't want to buy a 1/4-inch drill, they want a 1/4-inch hole, right? In other words, define your product or service in consumer terms, not product terms. Elizabeth Arden was not selling tinfoil and paper mache. And then sometimes I use the Bain elements of value graphic, just to talk about how people think about the different levels of product value, functional, emotional, life-changing. If you do marketing, it's kind of nice to have this taped up near your desk. The reason I emphasize this question, what business are you in, is because too many entrepreneurs pitch a great product or service without knowing that answer. And you can't possibly size or analyze or segment your market, and you can't build a good business model without first really defining your business. The one your customers will define for you if you listen hard enough. The second and final mini case study involves the conclusion of Innovation on Tap, which is about the creation of Hamilton. It's kind of the other anchor store at the other end of the mall from Eli Whitney, and it's the opposite of Whitney. It's set in the present, and it has nothing to do with mechanization or even technology. And the mini case study here asks, I'm not a genius, what kind of value can I really bring to an innovation team? So most people know the story of the Broadway show. It was a cultural phenomenon. It's a financial windfall. I like to use entertainment because it makes it easy for people to understand the nature of innovation, this novel combination that Schumpeter writes about. For example, Thomas Jefferson was born in 1743. Rap was born around, 1980? Neither is especially new, but you combine them and something explosive occurs. A brand new audience is created who never cared about theater, maybe didn't care about American history, and they're suddenly flocking to Broadway. So let's stipulate for the record in this mini case study that Lin-Manuel Miranda is a genius. And he's a genius in particular at storytelling. But the way in which he uses the strengths of the people around him to create the final product, to build the innovation team, is a great model for all of us. It's also a good reminder that we all have weaknesses. There are holes in all of our games, and that community, the ability to build and nurture and leverage community, is an entrepreneur superpower. So let's build the innovation team that created Hamilton in the words of those who actually lived it. The genius sits in the middle. Tommy Kail was the director of Hamilton. Miranda says, when we were both broke and had day jobs, Tommy would say, bring in a song on Friday and we'll talk about it. He created deadlines for me and something for me to work toward. So there's a skill, maybe it's two skills. I'll call it the organizer and the enforcer, both important on an innovation team. Then Kail says of Miranda, one of Lane's great gifts is he doesn't stand up there and say, look where I am, you're down there. He builds a ladder and says, be up here with me. So my job was to try to help architect that ladder and get every single person to participate and feel like it's also for them. So I'll call this team architect. They're the person who will make sure that every person on the team can find a way to contribute. It's a critical role. And then Kail adds, my job was not to have the best idea in the room at any time, but to identify the best idea. That's a skill I'll call extractor. You probably can come up with names for these skills that don't sound like the World Wrestling Federation, but you get the idea. And then Alex Lacamoire was Hamilton's musical director. One of the people observing the Hamilton team at work said, Lin will have an amazing inspiration and put it forward in a way that you know exactly where he's driving, and Alex will pave the street. So that's a skill I'll call street paver. But it's the ability not just to pile on top of a conversation, but to take a partial idea from someone and help others sort of tease it out so it becomes complete. And then Jeff Sellers, the lead producer of Hamilton. His job involves maximizing profits and keeping the audience, the investors, and the cast happy. There's two essential skills and good ones to have on any team, and sometimes not always interesting to the genius in the middle. So that kind of builds out the functions of the team. You might be able to think of a few more as you read through the chapter. For example, legendary Stephen Sondheim was a critical outside expert that Miranda called on when he got stuck. Most teams have those kinds of resources. And Miranda also credits his wife, Vanessa, with helping to create the white spaces, so critical to the creative process. So when we think about an innovation team, don't forget the outside experts, and don't forget all the people who have to live with us through the long hours and the anxiety that your innovation team will undoubtedly generate. Writing Hamilton was 6 years of sitting alone, Miranda says, but the payoff is I get to go into a room with Tommy Kail and play a song for him, and he's got 3 ideas on how to make it even better. And then Alex has 3 more ideas on how to make it better. Bottom line, he says, is working with other people makes you smarter. We elevate each other. By the way, after opening night, after the flowers and the great reviews, the cast of Hamilton had to get up the next day and do it again, and again, and again, and again, right? It's part of the entrepreneurship that sometimes gets lost in the rush to innovate and dent the universe. I think of it in terms of the Egg McMuffin, right? Which was a true innovation in 1972. It launched the entire breakfast segment for fast food, and it taught us all that we could eat and drive at the same time. And what makes the Egg McMuffin successful? The fact that the company has been able to train thousands and thousands of unskilled 18-year-olds for years and years in every location to make it the same way every single day. The last thing you want at 7 a.m. in the morning is some 18-year-old deciding they want to innovate your breakfast. So the postscript to the Hamilton chapter is, there's plenty of room on an innovation team for all kinds of different talent. But there's also plenty of room off the innovation team to make sure that the product is successful. Helping people do the same thing brilliantly and enthusiastically and precisely again and again and again is a talent all its own. So lots of stories, lots of rats, lots of concepts and lessons and material here, but there are 3 things I want you to remember. The things that history teaches. Number 1, don't be fooled by the dominant narrative. Don't draw all of your remarkable conclusions from a single rat. Entrepreneurs come in all shapes and sizes. You don't have to look like anyone else to innovate, and your role may be on the team or it may be off the team. Both are crucial. The goal is creative destruction, emphasis on the creative that solves problems and improves life now for people around. Second, none of it matters without a practical, scalable, and ultimately profitable business model. Leadership, team building, a blockbuster innovation, grit, perseverance, all the things we read about all the time, they're all important, but history teaches that the business model is job number 1. It's where your innovation lives, it's where you create and hopefully delight customers. It is the critical skill of an entrepreneur. And last and probably most important, community is an entrepreneur superpower. Even if you are a genius, right? Networking is part of it, but leaping outside your strong network is part of it. And I think of really community building as less of a skill and more of a characteristic, being open to new opportunities, to the person who contacts you out of the blue and wants to buy you coffee and just network, walking down the hall at work or across the classroom at school to say hello to the person you don't know very well after working with them for 5 years or after being in class with them for 2 months. 20 years later, that willingness to connect can have a life-changing payoff. That's innovation on tap. I would remind you that it's designed to be read with beer or wine. Good time to start would be Memorial Day weekend. I keep a blog. It's called The Occasional CEO. I have a bunch of resources related to the book, including a guide for book groups, which is free. If you do happen to purchase the book on Amazon, please leave a review. Nobody understands how the Amazon algorithm works, but we know it's important to feed it. And if you drop me a note, I would be happy to mail you a signed or inscribed copy of the book for $25. But you don't have to buy anything from me. I'm happy to speak or correspond with you on any issues. So thanks for your interest. Happy Memorial Day, and let me turn it back over to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Eric. You yourself take a drink right now. Yes, take a break from those vocal cords. What I'd like to know right now, do we have any questions from the audience? Everyone was very patient, and I'm seeing a couple things come and trickle in right now. And it's a nice comment from your friend Barbara. So she wants to be an entrepreneur. It's never late to start. I don't know. Yeah, it's a good time to be one, especially now. Okay. If we have any more questions, please drop them into the chat box. Otherwise, what we want to know, Eric, is what gave you the inspiration to begin this book in the first place?
Well, as I said, I love to write. I had actually been at an after-work venture event. I won't tell you the name of the venture capital firm. We were out raising money at the time. I was with Hubcast. And it was one of these events where 3 of the portfolio CEOs present. And when you present in front of your peers and your team and your investors and potential investors, the story's always good, right? There's a hockey stick curve up on one of the slides and everything's great. But afterwards, they had created kind of a mini bar, makeshift bar, and we were all standing around in a circle. And that's when the true stories started to come out, the real stories. and one person had lost, one of their important programmers, and their project was behind them. Everyone was running out of money, and they had to go out and raise some money. And as I was driving home that night, I thought, I had all this. I started to do the research, and I gathered all this information, and I thought, this is maybe the way to do it. People will let their hair down at a bar and tell the truth. So why don't we get them all together at a bar?
Gotcha. All right, appreciate that. I'm seeing a couple of questions trickle in. Two very different questions, but we'll start with Zaki. Are you considering any advisory and board roles? If it's a question you want to get into here and today.
I see someone from the Gettysburg Foundation. I sit on a nonprofit board at the Gettysburg Foundation, which sort of appeals to both my business and history love. I generally do, if I do one board at a time, and I'm not on a board right now, so I'm here.
Yeah. There's another question that came through. And you spoke about this a little bit earlier, and they want to know about Gillette and why the razor blades model is a myth.
It is, say again?
Why is the razor blades model at Gillette a myth?
Oh, okay. So when you think, or when I think of the razor blade model, I think of, a printer. You sell a really cheap printer, and then you hook someone into the print cartridges, and they're really expensive. I'm looking to my right. I'm looking at the monster that eats our income every month, right? That's the razor blade model. Cheap handle, and then expensive recurring revenue blades. Well, they proposed that. It's a kind of a funny story. They proposed that, and the head of the board of Gillette was a bottler, and he said, "There's no way we're going to do this. We have a patent. The patent runs, I think, another 11 or 12 years. You don't underprice genius." So they actually ended up charging an arm and a leg for the handle. I think it was like a third of a salary for someone in a week. It was like a cheap cell phone today. And they ran with that expensive handle, and I think they were fairly expensive razors, until their patent ran out. Then they adopted what we think of as the razor blade model. But there's an old maxim that we learned, I think, Neil, we learned in business school, which is you never underprice genius. The other maxim was when you're drinking from the money river, don't slurp, because it catches other people's attention. But don't underprice genius. And I think that's the real lesson from the Gillette story. And in fact, as some of you know, you can always come down. It's very hard to go back up. You start a little higher, and if you need to, you work your way down.
Gotcha. Sage word. I agree with that. And now people are beginning to really ask their questions. Can you say a little bit more about the question of when it's okay for an entrepreneur to tell a few fibs?
Yeah, that's good. So let me go on the record by saying it's never okay to lie. Okay, it's just never okay to lie. But you have to understand, and I saw this in book publishing, I've seen it in startups, it's really competitive. Right? I think we have some venture people on. I don't know, you see 1,000 business models a year, 500 business, a lot of business models. And you know that there are people out there who are being very aggressive. And you need to be aggressive. And you also know that whoever looks at your numbers is going to give them a haircut. They're not going to trust them completely. Right? So I think it's okay to be really aggressive while you're being really transparent. So if I have 6 assumptions in my spreadsheet, I can take the top of every assumption and end up, instead of at 20 million in revenue, 40 million in revenue. But I just want to disclose that. I want to say, if everything goes according to my plan, and I give them the numbers, then I'm going to be at $40 million. So I've been aggressive without actually having to lie. I think it's also okay, and this is what I think Steve Jobs did and what Whitney tried to do, is I can say, I'm going to sell you this product, but it's not quite ready yet. It's 3 months away, it's 6 months away. Again, if you're transparent, I don't consider it a lie. But selling vaporware, that sort of thing, to me, it's out. No such thing as a true lie. Does that make sense to people? I have a friend who calls it the purple defense. If I can say something to you without turning purple, then it passes muster. If I turn purple, then it's probably not okay to say.
A few smiling faces in the crowd. And I really do welcome anybody that has a question and wants to take themselves off mute. Feel free to do so. There's a couple more coming through right now.
have a question if we can come up.
Go ahead.
Great, awesome, thank you. So I'm very focused on innovation ecosystems and bringing together founders and IP lawyers and venture capitalists and governments and all that jazz. So in this process or in your research, have you found someone who's really good at that, of building up the community around them to encourage that innovation-driven entrepreneurship?
Yeah, well, I could certainly put in a plug for Dan Eisenberg. He was the professor at business at Harvard. He then went on and taught at Babson, but he has an entire scale-up program that he's taken to a number of cities around the world. And he's easy, he's accessible, he's writing all the time. He's a very good guy, and he's someone who I could highly recommend in terms of understanding what an ecosystem is and how it works, and then helping to build it.
What was that name again?
So it's Eisenberg, B-E-R-G, Eisen, I-S-E-N-B-E-R-G, Daniel. And you can find him, just Google him. You'll see him associated with Babson or Harvard or Scale Up. It's a really good, the other, so I mentioned Silicon Valley, which everyone recognizes as an innovation community. I also mentioned New Orleans, which if you read that chapter, you'll see how that works. It's very collaborative, but it's also very competitive. You can't protect anything, right? Once you write the software, it's sort of out there. Once you play the note, it's out there. There was a cornet player who tried to put a handkerchief over his fingers. Doesn't work. If you can hear it, you can duplicate it, right? But the other one was Detroit in the 1920s. There's a great scene when Alfred Sloan first moves into Detroit. There's the Pontchartrain restaurant, which is where all of the mechanics gather at lunch. And when you leave, you can see all the drawings on the napkins of crankshafts and crankcases and so forth that they're trying to scheme together. So there's a little bit in the book about third places, Ray Oldenburg's third places. First place is home, second place is work. Third place is a place where you can go, where everyone drops their titles. There's no pecking order. Barbershops are a good example. Starbucks might be a good example, but in any really high functioning innovation community, there are these third places. And they're places where competitors can get together. We're supposed to be competing during the day, but at night they can share ideas. And that's part of the lubrication of these communities.
And shameless plug over here, that's also the role that Venture Cafe play into the ecosystem. We try and be a platform to bring government, research development, entrepreneurs, investors together to create collision points. I saw you smile, Eric.
My bad.
You know, I
missed that one. I'm sorry, Sean. Absolutely.
When we're talking about it, like I said, we're a strong ecosystem, and you're part of that. So it's not, whether it's Babson, whether it's Venture Cafe, whether it's Techstars, we're really just happy to be able to support the smart people that we have doing hard work in the city.
You know, there's a really famous book by Anna Saxarian, I think. She's a professor out in the West Coast, called Regional Advantage, and it compares the growth of 128 and Silicon Valley. And one of the issues with 128 is you had these silos companies, right? The data generals and what you're doing, I think, is breaking down those silos and giving people an opportunity to come together.
Indeed. Well, thank you, everyone. I think we had one more comment I saw in the chat box was, Eric, if you do any startup coaching. I'm not sure if you do, but if you don't, I think it's my job to bring you onto the platform. So you look out for that email from me.
All right, thanks. Thank you.
Thanks,
everyone. Happy Memorial Day.
Exactly. Get yourself some sunshine today. Be safe. We're very happy that you all came on board, and we'll be in touch soon about more to come.
Thank you. So long.